Hi, everyone. Welcome to another workshop provided to you by the Writing Support Center. My name is Genesis. I'm one of the faculty in the Writing Support Center, and today we're going to be talking about a hot topic. They're right around the corner, and that is transfer essays. And in this workshop, we're going to be providing you with 8 tips to help you write your best transfer essay. So, an overview of today's agenda, we will be starting off by reviewing the UC Personal Insight questions, also abbreviated as PIQ, and the common application. We're going to review 8 tips to help with writing a transfer essay. We're also going to review essay structures that you can use in your personal statements, and then we'll also have a couple of brainstorming activities, just to get you started if you haven't gotten started already. Some expectations for today's workshop. To get the most out of this workshop, you will need to complete the accompanying activity worksheet. You will also need to reference the accompanying handouts. This includes the UC Personal Insight Question Guide for transfer applicants, and then the 8 tips for transfer essays. Also, just feel free to take your time. Feel free to pause and rewind parts that you felt were confusing or went a little too fast. This is really a video that you can watch at your own pace. Do not feel the need to rush through it. What's the difference between the UC PIQs and the Common App? To start off, the UC Personal Insight questions, these are the questions that are sent out to the University of California universities. So if you're applying to a UC, this is the application that you would have to fill out. These are considered the essay for UC transfer applicants. And the way it works is that there are 7 questions total with one required question. This required question is a question that all transfer applicants need to answer. But in addition to that one question, you will also be choosing 3 other questions to answer. So in total, you will be writing 4 responses. So this may sound like a lot, but when you take a closer look at it, uh, it's not as much because it's only 350 words per question. So your response will only consist of 350 words. And, that can be a little bit of a challenge, but not to worry. We're going to be talking about how you can approach answering these questions and making the most out of those 350 words. One thing to keep in mind is that all the questions are created equal. So this means that um, the UC system does not prefer one question over the other. They really just want to get some insight into you as a student holistically, and they really want you to choose the questions that best fit you in order to get the best insight into whom you are. And then there's the common application. This application is mostly done if you are applying to out-of-state schools or private schools. And this application consists of a required essay or essays throughout the website. But one thing to keep in mind is that each university might require additional personal statements. So if you are primarily applying to um, private schools or out-of-state schools, just keep in mind that you will have to keep track of each institution's individual um, personal statement requirements, because some of them might require 1 or 2 more statements in addition to the required uh, essays by the Common App. For the Common App, there is a maximum of 650 words, so a little more than the UC Personal Insight questions one, but 650 words may also not seem like a lot of space to give your life story. So we're going to be talking about how we can best paint the picture of who you are, so that way these colleges and universities see who you are. So tip number 1, review the prompts. Prior to starting prior to just jumping in and writing, I really recommend for you to read and annotate the personal statement prompts. So be sure to circle and highlight any key terms, make notes on what you can potentially write about. So start taking some notes in the margins or in a notebook. Identify the key idea that the prompt is asking for. Um, and the reason I say to do this is because when you do these steps, you're then able to group similar prompts together. So you might notice while you're reading and annotating these prompts that you have two personal statements that want you to talk about a time that you were a leader. Um, and the way that you can approach it is instead of writing two personal statements about how you were a leader, you can write one personal statement about how you were a leader and then just adapt it to meet the needs of both of those applications. So this way you're hitting two birds with one stone. You know, it's really about working smarter, not harder. You're easing up a little bit of the pressure. You know, you're not having to write too many essays, but rather you might be able to only need to write one or two key statements and then just tweak them, mold them to fit the needs of the university that you are submitting it for. So it's really just saving you time and energy from having to uh, write too much and stress yourself even further. Tip number two, be sure to select the best prompt for you. So, one thing to keep in mind is that all prompts are created equal. These are prompts that the university put forward to really just try to um, see who you are, and they want to get an idea of who you are as a holistic student, meaning a student outside of the classroom. So, they really presented these multiple questions so that way you have the most opportunity to write about whatever it is that you want to write about. So you want to be sure that you're choosing a prompt that best reflects you. Avoid answering a prompt because it seems like the best one. For example, some folks might want to answer a question about leadership experience because they want to show the admissions committee, like, I'm a leader, this is how I'm a leader. But if you're having a hard time thinking about how to describe yourself as a leader, you know, maybe that isn't the best prompt for you to do. And instead, you would choose to write about a prompt that is asking you to talk about your creativity and how you've been creative. You know, in that prompt, you can still talk about how you're a leader coming up with creative solutions, but it just allows you to take a different approach. And it really just allows you to as, shine more light to whom you are. And lastly, and we're going to go into this next tip a little more, but choose the prompt that allows you to tell a story or a narrative. So again, choosing a prompt that best reflects you and a prompt that allows you to really tell a story or a narrative about yourself, because that is sometimes the best way to show admissions committees who you are. So we're going to start off with our first activity, and we're going to start off by reviewing the prompts. So in the module, as I mentioned in the beginning, there's an accompanying worksheet, and that's where you're going to write your responses to this activity. But you will also need to reference the UC Personal Insight Question Guide for Transfer Students handout, and that is also found in the module. So you're going to review the prompts that are found in that handout, and on the worksheet, you're going to answer the following questions. What is the prompt asking for? Is there a particular trait, quality, or experience it wants you to focus on? If so, what is it? Is there a prompt that you think would be best for you? Why? So just take a moment, pause this video, and take a moment to take a look at those questions and answer the questions that were read out loud. So, tip number three, brainstorm stories. So, in the previous tip, we talked about wanting to make sure that you are choosing a prompt that can um, allow you to tell a story or a narrative. And the reason for this is because when you're writing a story or giving them a narrative, you're actually able to show multiple strengths and qualities. It helps you avoid cliches or general language. So, because you're telling a story about yourself, you're more likely to be more specific. You're less likely to sound as if you're writing off your resume, as if you're writing off information that's already included in your application, and you're really able to explore all the different parts of your life. So, for example, you can talk about work, you can talk about a leadership experience that you've taken in the workplace, or um, a time that you have helped resolve conflict in the workplace. You can talk about family. You can talk about the way that you supported your family. Um, Especially now that in a remote setting, what is the role that you're playing in your family? If you've grown up being a translator, you can talk about that experience. You can talk about school, the time, maybe there was a class that you weren't doing so well in, but you found a way to persevere and pass the class. Community service, if you take part in any community service, what have you learned from those experiences? It's anything that you find interesting to you. Um, by being able to brainstorm a story, you're able to really just think about these different parts of your life and try to see which parts best fit the different prompts that are given to you. With that being said, we're going to go back to the activity handout, and now we're going to start brainstorming. So go back to the prompts you feel you would answer. Um, and well, not with a partner, but well, if you have someone there that you want to talk to, always encourage, because sometimes that's one of the best ways that we can get our ideas out. But on the handout, write 1 to 2 potential stories or things that you can talk about for the prompt. So, how do these stories answer the prompt? Why are you choosing them? Tip number 4, just write. So once you know what you want to write about, you have an idea of the story that you want to give, uh, begin to tell it. And feel free to embellish it as much as you want, or not embellish it, but write as much about the story as you want, because it's easier to cut than it is to add. Um, so it's easier to cut words, take out phrases, paragraphs. It's easier to cut them rather than try to add additional things, because there's definitely times where maybe you are at 250 words and you feel like you really want to use those last 100. um Sometimes it's harder to add those last 100 because you might be wondering, like, well, what more can I talk about? So feel free to write as much as you want when you're just starting out, because we'll be able to take it out later. It also erases the fear of the blank page. So one of the biggest things that prevents us from feeling like we can write is because we just see this blank page and we just want to see it filled, but we're not always sure of the best way to do that. So if you just start writing, don't worry about grammar, don't worry about the coherency of ideas. All of that could be fixed later. Um, just getting your ideas down is the best way to start. Tip number 5, you are the star. So, one common mistake that I often see in personal statements is that students will write about a person that inspired them, but they end up writing half of the statement focusing on that person rather than focusing on themselves, the real star of the essay. And so admissions folks would read that statement and think like, cool, I want to admit this person's mom because I know more about the mom rather than the student. So you just want to make sure that you are the focus of the essay. You're more than welcome to write about others, because I completely understand that we often succeed because of the people that are rooting us on, the people that are inspiring us, motivating us, but they should not be the focus of the statement. You should always be the focus of it because you are trying to show yourself to the admissions team. So you want to make sure that you're talking about others in a way that supports you or highlights your strengths. So really just making sure that you're they're the supporting characters. The way I like to think about it is, if this was a movie, you would be the main character and everyone else is your supporting character. So when you're typing up your personal statement, you want to think of it as a movie. You're the main character, everyone else is the supporting character. So whenever you want to reference their stories, it's always about how it's going to uplift you. Tip number 6, make sure that you are staying clear and focused. So I usually recommend that there's some sort of thesis or a main point that answers the prompt, um, or at least a sentence that lets the reader know what you want them to take away, or lets the reader know of like what that main point is. You want to make sure that your essay is supporting that main point. So having supporting details, conversations, actions, something that demonstrates how this main point is coming to life throughout the personal statement. You also want to make sure that there's a clear logic. The order and the structure should make sense for the essay. It should try to have a beginning, middle, and end. Whatever that order may be, it should have those three components to the story. Right. Tip number 7. So you have written it all out, and now you are ready to start revising, start taking out things. But sometimes the question is, I don't know what to take out. Everything feels important. Well, keep in mind, word counts and character limits make every word choice valuable. So you want to make sure that every word chosen serves a purpose. When we're considering what to cut out, you want to make sure that you're avoiding tangents or too much backstory. So if you find yourself describing a project that you found really difficult and you're describing the project super in depth, that it almost takes up like half of your word count. Chances are the admissions committee doesn't need that much information regarding the assignment. So you could probably limit that backstory to maybe like 1 or 2 sentences and then focus more about how you um, worked on that project and why it was difficult for you, but ultimately what the steps that you took um, to achieve that score you wanted. Um, Also be making sure to avoid tangents. So again, if you're talking about someone that you really admire, not talking too much about them, making sure that the story stays focused to the integral part, to your main point. Again, this is why it's helpful to have some sort of thesis or some sort of like main idea or theme. And it's because it helps you avoid these two aspects. It helps you avoid the tangents and the backstory. Think about if you have already mentioned it. If you have, you might want to cut it out because it just comes off as repetitive. If you're going to use adjectives or adverbs, be sure to stick to using one. There's no need to have a list of 10 different adjectives when they're not serving a higher purpose. Uh, Avoid using 2 words when one does the job. So if you feel like there's a way that you can condense a phrase, um, feel free, be sure to do that. And of course, you can always get feedback from a tutor. Our tutors are trained to help with personal statements and transfer essays. So they're aware of how to support you with that. And one thing that they always keep in mind is, um, they since they're looking at it from an outsider's point of view, they're able to notice some of these things that might be a little harder to notice when you're so focused on the assignment. And lastly, tip number 8, proofread, proofread, proofread. You want to make sure you're sending forth the best uh, personal statement, the best transfer essay possible. So be sure to check for grammar, punctuation, diction, making sure that everything that you've chosen, making sure your grammar is good, your punctuation is good, your word choice is strong. Make sure that you're remaining within the word count. Some systems won't let you submit your essay if it is over the word count. So that's just something to keep in mind, is that it won't let you submit if it's over. Make sure you have the right school in the essay. Um, I've definitely seen applications where someone is applying for one school and then they put a completely different school in the application. So just try to make sure you're avoiding that issue. Especially if you are writing one personal statement that you are molding into different ones, for the different schools. Just be sure that you have the right school in it, or better yet, just avoid specifying a school altogether. Um, Sometimes being a little general is totally fine, especially if the prompt isn't saying, "Why do you want to attend USC?" You don't, if the prompt isn't asking you to talk about the school specifically, then there's no need to mention the school. And then, of course, be sure you can always get feedback from a tutor, and our tutors are more than happy to help you learn how to proofread and check these different areas. Essay structure. So there's a couple different ways that you can approach essay structure in a personal statement or transfer essay. One is the classic intro, body, conclusion. So having an introduction with a clear hook or thesis, the body that has context, and then the conclusion where you're bringing it back to the main idea. That's always a classic way to go. You can't go wrong with this. So it's a highly recommended structure. If you feel a little more confident, and you want to give your hand at having something a little more creative, you can definitely take a more narrative or storytelling structure. So this is organic. It's a little more as if you're speaking to the reader. There's a little more of a fluid structure, and you can include dramatic intros, dialogue, etc. But you do want to keep these things to a minimum, just because, again, it could be really easy to get swept up in the storytelling, into the very creative storytelling, that you suddenly lose focus or you go over the word count. So, uh, dialogue is a really helpful sort of hook if you want to do that. Seeing, those are all very creative things that you can include, but just making sure that it's not distracting or taking away from the main idea or purpose of the statement. Great. So that brings us to the end. In summary, just be sure to start your essays early to give yourself plenty of time to brainstorm, write, and revise. Uh, Remember that you are the focus of the story you are telling, so always making sure that you are highlighting yourself. And in that sense, it's okay to brag about your accomplishments. You are showing your best self. So if you want to brag about an award that you won, go for it. Especially if it was an award that you weren't expecting to win. Those kinds of things are definitely things that the schools want to see. Be sure to get additional feedback on your transfer essay. There are a lot of different resources at PCC that you can get additional feedback on your writing. One of them being us, the Writing Support Center. Our tutors are more than happy to support you in your path to transfer. There's also the PCC Transfer Center website. If you type in PCC Transfer Center into Google, it'll be the first option that comes up. And on their website, they have information as to how you can get feedback on a paper, meet with the transfer counselor. Especially now that everything is remote, they have those resources available. So definitely go check that out. There's also the UC website, applying as a transfer. That is where you can find the UC personal statement, personal insight question handout, along with additional tips that they have. You can also talk to an academic counselor or a trusted faculty member to help you look over your personal statements and see if what you are writing is on the right track and if you feel it's the best version of yourself that you are showing. One thing to keep in mind is these personal statements are usually the only insight that they get into you outside of your application. So you really want to make sure that you're putting forth um, your best writing. And with that, thank you and good luck and good skill on writing those applications. And we're more than happy to help you in any way that we can. Thank you.